Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to our live virtual workshop, Designing Public Spaces with artist Tory Tepp. My name is Amanda Poss. I'm the Gallery Director for Hillsborough Community College and the Committee Chair for Grounds4Art at HCC, which oversees public art initiatives. This is our third installment in our event series about our new public art project titled NEST, short for Nourishment, Education, and Social Terraces. And NEST will be completed at the HCC Dale Mabry and Ybor City campuses in the spring of 2021. Your participation tonight and in our event series, all of your comments this fall are crucial to the project, as these are going to inform the artist's design for each site. So a couple quick things about our Zoom meeting. We are recording the event and we'll work to make it available online at our YouTube channel. If you want to know right away when this will be made available, all you need to do is subscribe at Gallery221 HCC. You might have also noticed that all of our audience members tonight are muted. However, we do welcome your participation in the chat section, and we'd love to see you all say hello, write your feedback, and ask questions along the way. Now, before I say a few words of thanks and then introduce Tory Tepp, our artist, I would like to introduce Dr. Keith Berry for a few words of welcome. So Dr. Berry, if you're here, go ahead and unmute and show your video. Dr. Keith Berry is Dean of the Associate in Arts Program in HCC Ybor City. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. I had to unmute and unmask myself. I'm coming to you from the Ybor City campus. First of all, hello, my name is Keith Berry. I'm Dean of Academic Affairs here at the Ybor City campus of Hillsborough Community College. And on behalf of the administration, under the leadership of Dr. Ginger Clark, I would like to welcome you to this groundbreaking event. We are so excited to have not only the artist Tory Tepp here, but we're also excited that we have great people that work at the college like Amanda Poss, who are able to bring such fantastic artists to our attention here in the community. So with that, please have a great virtual tour of what she is going to put forth, and we are glad that you're here participating with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry. So I have a few words of thanks for our supporters and contributors. So first, I want to express my gratitude to all of our NEST sponsors. Their sponsorship, commitment, and financial support is what makes this project possible, even in the midst of a global pandemic. My thanks also to our college administration for their support, our HCC campus presidents, Dr. Alan Witt for Dale Mabry and Dr. Ginger Clark for Ybor, as well as our art deans, including Dr. Berry, who you just heard from, as well as Amy Bousquet here at the Dale Mabry campus. I would also like to extend my appreciation to my gallery team, Emiliano Sedicasi and Mark Miller, who helped to put this event together and who are working behind the scenes, as well as my extensive NEST steering committee, which is made up of HCC faculty, staff, students, and also local community partners. Thank you all so very much. Finally, my sincere appreciation to our special guest tonight, our artist, Tory Tepp, who's joining us virtually all the way in Wisconsin. So Tory, go ahead and unmute. I'll just say a couple quick things and then you can take over. I want to just remind our audience one more time that our session will end with some Q&A. And as we're going through the design workshop, feel free to input your comments and questions at any time as we go along. And you can just do that in the chat section. Now a little bit about Tory Tepp, our creative lead for NEST. Tory received his undergraduate BFA in painting from Parsons, the new school for design in New York City, and an MFA in 2009 from in public practice as part of the inaugural class of Suzanne Lacy's public practice program at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. It's here that he developed his practice around the exploration and reestablishment of the metaphysical connections between the social and environmental ecologies that shape urban communities. Tory has completed projects all over the US, including New Orleans, Milwaukee, Los Angeles, Death Valley, the High Sierra Mountains, New Smyrna Beach, Tampa, and the Wormfarm Institute in Wisconsin. So now I'll turn it over to Tory to tell you a little bit about his background and to lead us through this design workshop.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you everybody for showing up today. A couple things I want to just start with is just kind of tell you what I plan to do here today. And I'd like to go over a little bit about my background, how I got into this and how it shaped my current practice, but then also just talk a little bit about the different types of public art. I mean, a lot of times when people say public art, it can mean many things nowadays instead of just being a memorial or a sculpture plopped in a public space. And then I'm going to go through some of sort of the basic tenets of what to consider when you're doing public art or designing a public space. And then we'll follow with actually doing some site mapping on the maps you picked up with some of the images of the sites we're going to be working in. And once we kind of go over those ways to look at that space, I would invite you to take your maps, actually go out to these spaces if you're able to safely, and just start taking all that we talked about into consideration and see what kind of designs you can come up with. See if it changes your perception of this space once we've kind of gone over all these things to consider. Yeah, so that's kind of the goal of this, is to get you thinking about these specific spaces when you're out there. That'll help us figure out what we actually want to design out there and how we can do it together, which is sort of one of the main things. But my background, so I was having kind of a crisis in art making, which ended up steering me into this new program out in Los Angeles that was about public art. And it was founded by a woman named Suzanne Lacy, who has literally written the book on community engaged practice and is not only a phenomenal artist, but a phenomenal educator. And what was interesting about this program was that very little of my instruction over those 2 years was actually in the visual arts field. A great deal of it came from urban anthropologists, came from activists, came from community leaders, because the idea here was this: if you're going to be making art out in public space, I mean, first of all, if you're in grad school, you should already have the basics down for making sculpture or painting or murals or whatever. But this, because it was focused on community, was how do we train artists to navigate the really often contentious and difficult ways of communicating with different communities. How do you navigate the conversation, and how do you actually even initiate a conversation with some of these communities, especially if you're an outsider? And if you're going into spaces that are contested or willing to host some kind of intervention, generally for a person like me, I was definitely an outsider. So, how my practice developed, and a lot of you may or may not have seen the very first talk that we did, which is studio chat. I developed my very first earthwork was on the Otis campus. And it was kind of a similar problem to the one we're facing here at Ness. It's like, how do you shape this public space? And in this instance, I brought in a bunch of clean soil, and it wasn't so much about making a sculpture, even though you can view it as a sculpture and you can stand back from it and view it from that perspective. It was really intended to create a public space that could be enjoyed by the Otis College community. And in the end, it ended up staying up all year, and classes came out and were taught in it. And it gave me kind of an interesting perspective on the things I did right and the things I did wrong when dealing with a public space. But it also really got me thinking about what happens when things die. Grass will die, vegetation will go through its seasonal cycles. So it made me very aware of that, as well as how to recycle materials. So in a place like Los Angeles, getting that much clean soil was not easy. And so I chose to save my soil and recycle it. And in the end, that meant taking the form of just some roadside gardens in the neighborhood I lived in LA. And these weren't intended to be an art project, but as these grew and became lush, I started to be able to harvest fresh produce from the street in LA every day, which was kind of mind-blowing to me. But my neighbors, as they passed through to get to the LA River walking path, would stop to talk to their kids or each other in these gardens. And eventually that led to me being able to have a conversation and a dialogue with my community. And that was kind of a big aha moment for me in my art practice, that, you know, some of these things speak to us all so inherently and are so ubiquitous to pretty much every culture. It became an easy starting point, or maybe not easy, but it became a starting point with which to engage my neighbors in a conversation. And I still use sort of both of those practices today, both sort of an ecological and, you know, reuse outlook on my materials, but also, you know, how can we design these spaces so that they're comfortable and open, and you know, the history of the space isn't weighing down on people so much that they're afraid to really, you know, speak or act or, you know, get their point across or be creative in that space. So that's kind of one of the main points of my project now is, or my process is to sort of create spaces that allow the creativity of the piece themselves, or be very involved in the creative process, which is what we're hoping to do here, is get you all involved in this creative process on these really two wonderful sites that we have available to us. So now I'm just going to talk about a few different types of public art, and granted, I'm being fairly general here, and I've got some listed, but it'll kind of give you an overall way to look at some of this stuff, because when you say public art, I mean, I think most people have some pretty specific ideas of what that means. You know, you can look at, you know, like the giant bean in Chicago as something that's, you know, so popular, everybody loves it, gets their picture taken with it. You know, it's pretty typical. In every city, there's a giant Picasso or a massive steel sculpture that's just been commissioned by somebody famous and put in there. And that's the pretty standard and generic definition of public art. Fortunately, we've come to a point where things have evolved beyond that, that can be a little bit more engaging or even more interesting, especially if it's in somebody's community. You know, why would you guys want me to come and make some of my work in your community unless you're involved in it, right? Or it has some meaning to you. So that has led to, there's community engaged practice, which is sort of where my training and background comes from. And community engaged practice is where you start a dialogue with a specific community, and through that dialogue, the artwork results, right? Sometimes the dialogue is enough, you know, sometimes you never actually get to a point where you make something, but just the fact that you had a meaningful dialogue becomes the art. But in most cases, it's nice and where the artist sort of almost acts as a facilitator, and by giving the community a voice and by, you know, kind of framing the whole thing within a creative kind of vision, it allows the community to get out there and actually, you know, author their own desires, their own needs. And the artist just helps, you know, them creatively design what they've been talking about. And one of the examples I have is, my director did a project called the Crystal Quilt up in Minneapolis. And her community was the local aging and elderly women in that community who often did not have a voice, and who were kind of, there were a lot of misconceptions about this community, what they were capable of and what they weren't capable of and who they were. So what she did is she created this massive meeting space called the Crystal Quilt, where they all sat and had discussions with each other while they actually quilted. So they did make a quilt, but in the end, the real quilt was what you see here, which was this patchwork of conversations that really helped empower these women and give them a voice. And of course, there were numerous workshops that splintered off of this that also featured other women artists, and really kind of gave a spotlight to some of the issues that these women were, you know, feeling unheard, and brought it to some real prominence up there in Minneapolis. It was a beautiful project. Another kind of project, type, which a lot of these kind of overlap and engage, but with each other in various ways. But then there's what's commonly called social practice, which I think is kind of an umbrella for most of what we do now. And that can be something simple like a walking tour. It's, you know, it's where you design a project that engages people in a social way, but not necessarily like in a specific community. So there's a lot of artists have walking tours where you go around and you listen to some, to a narrative, or it guides you through a specific cultural community for you to take part in. I think Mel Chin's $100 Bill project is a massive social practice project where, you know, he took a specific desire to remediate lead contaminated soil in New Orleans and to kind of combine with the overall conversation around lead poisoning in children. And what this was just a nationwide drawing project where kids and adults all over the country had an opportunity to design their own $100 bill. And then all these bills were taken to Congress. And I mean, this project went on for over 10 years. And in the end, they actually helped initiate new standards for lead poisoning that's currently out there being debated, because now that the medicine on lead poisoning has gotten so far beyond the legislation on it that, you know, it's continuing to be a problem, and it really doesn't need to be. So this is like a massive scale kind of social practice project, which is really beautiful. And I was really happy to be a part of that team, driving in that armored car around the country.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Tory, because for people who might not recognize, you've got a big beard right now, but your image here.
Oh yeah, look at that. Jeez, 10 years ago. Then there's also, you know, we have things like environmental art, which is something my work really steers into that. You know, there's so many issues out in the world, and I think what's been happening over the past 50 or 60 years is with artists who've been getting out of the studio and into public space, it's like, you know, if art has all this power to bring creative change to communities, we ought to be doing something with it. And that's kind of been the impetus for so many of these projects, is to really try and enact social change. And a lot of my work is really also about bringing an ecological or environmental awareness. You know, now that we're in the middle of climate crisis, whether or not we can ever get it under control, so we have to try, but you know, climate crisis is going to get us all regardless of our social problems. So for me, that's kind of become like my number one issue, is how can we, you know, I think, you know, if we change the way we think about our interaction with the land and with the earth, that will inherently shift the way we treat each other. So there's quite a few different types of environmental and ecological art out there. Again, I'm going to use Mel Chin as an example, but he did a project in Minneapolis and several other places where he built a garden on an old industrial site that was contaminated with heavy metals. This is called Revival Fields. It's one of the earliest examples of an artist using phytoremediation or plants to actually clean up a site. And the plants he put in here are called hyperaccumulators, because they absorb heavy metals from the soil. So not only did he do the actual garden, but there's all kinds of drawings that he did. And in the end, when they burned the plants after they matured, they were actually able to get more heavy metal out of the ash from burning the plants that you could by mining the same amount from the soil. So it's really kind of this interesting, beautiful project that had some real scientific and environmental repercussions to it. And then I guess one of them that may not be a specific genre, but is kind of what we're talking about, which is designing public space. And this kind of edges on landscape architecture, urban planning. A lot of this goes into like the planning of parks and things like that. You know, one of the maybe most famous examples is the Vietnam War Memorial, which was designed by Maya Lin, who incidentally is also one of the great earthwork makers. But this isn't just about the monument with the names. This is literally about this entire space and the way that she put this together. It's a pretty profound piece once you're in the middle of it. And it's really about creating this feeling when you're in this space to honor these people and to instill you with this sense of loss and grief and kind of wonder at the whole thing. So those are a few of the different types of public art, and how, there's no one way to go about it, and there's no, when in our project here, we can incorporate, aspects of all of these if we want. The community engaged practice part is going to be a little bit more difficult, and that's, initially we were all supposed to be having this conversation in those sites in real time. So it's kind of hard to do community work on Zoom. I mean, we're trying our best, but since I can't really hear any of you, it's not as much of a conversation as I would like it to be, unfortunately, but that's the world we live in today.
Type into the chat.
So
people,
what's that?
You can type it into the chat. We'll read them out for you as they go in, so they can still converse. It's just a little delay. It's the world we live in, right?
and hopefully you'll if there's any like burning questions, you feel free to interrupt me at any time. And if it looks like I've just stepped out of an 80s Terminator movie, it's just because it was 45 degrees in the barn where I'm at, so I'm pounding coffee to try and stay warm on the inside. So with that, I'd like to kind of move on to just some of the tenets and principles that we think about when we're kind of working in this. And for me, there's two main areas, and one is identifying your community and establishing a dialogue with that community. Excuse me. And the second one is sort of understanding your site. Emiliano has printed and downloaded and printed some maps, so you each should all have maps of both of our sites. And I think there's also a nice link that they will show for the Google Earth, an overhead image of these sites as well, that you can print out copies of these to use for drawing out there, or, coming up with ideas. Any information you want to add to this that might be interesting to accumulate in terms of putting our project together. But some of the, I'm just going to really quickly go through these. Some of the things that I think about when I'm going into a project, especially in terms of the community. It's really important to go into a community without thinking that you're there to help them or that you're there to tell them anything, really. The initial part of the artist is to facilitate a conversation and listen, listen to your community first and foremost. But some of the things are, who does the project serve? Who are the community stakeholders in this project? We did a project in New Orleans that we were invited to come in, and the project site was on the NOCA campus, which is New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, which is their performing arts high school, which is very famous. A lot of famous musicians came out of there. And this was the site of a famous civil rights action in 1894 when Homer Plessy got thrown off the train on purpose because he was a very light-skinned African-American. And he went on there because what they were trying to do was protest the Segregated Car Act. So we were invited to activate. They were trying to turn this historic site where he got arrested and thrown off the train into a park and a memorial to this action. At the time, it was this huge lawsuit called Plessy versus Ferguson. And actually, they lost, and what followed were even harsher Jim Crow laws in that area. But when we came in there, we discovered that the students at Douglas High School had already been working on this. And then when NOCA came into it, which is a much more privileged school, then they were upset. And then the Crescent City Peace Alliance, we had so many different groups trying to come into play on this site that people were really getting upset. And certain groups were like, well, if they're participating in this project, we're out. And so it was really interesting to learn how to navigate contested groups within the same community. And so in that instance, there was this huge green wall there, and we turned it into a series of blackboards and like a schoolhouse where we just asked simple questions. What does it mean to be a citizen? What are civil rights? and then wave after students would come up and fill these in. And it ended up, it was a very brief project. It literally was only there for one weekend. But it was really interesting to get to see how these kids responded to these questions. And in the end, you know, it was still kind of well, people had issues with the piece, but we tried to bring as many people to the table as we could. And I think that's one of the things to always be aware of, is like, who can you get to the table, and how you can have a peaceful dialogue around whatever issue it is that needs to be talked about. But that's the other question. It's like, what are the community needs? You know, why are you having the conversation? You know, what's apparent in this situation, or what's bubbling to the surface? You know, what is it that needs to be talked about? Is it, you know, that's a huge issue. And if you're working with environmental projects, the question becomes, what are the environmental imperatives here? You know, is it contaminated by industrial waste? Is it making people sick? You know, what do we need to do to this space? And, you know, so there you have one, who you're working with, and drawing out the question, what are we working on, or what are we hoping to achieve? Then the question of contested space, with which, you know, we just this can be a wide range of things, whether there's different groups of people who think they have ownership of the space, whether it's environmentally contaminated, maybe it's in the middle of a gang neighborhood, which can be very difficult to work with. There's a lot of different things to consider about contested space. And, you know, how do you do interventions in these spaces? You know, the piece I just showed you, that what we did there might be called an intervention. You know, going back to other contested artworks, I kind of skipped over this, but, you know, in terms of public projects, there's been some very, you know, the space itself wasn't contested, but the artwork that got brought. One of the most famous examples is Tilted Arc by Richard Serra, where he designed this massive tilted plate of steel that was put in the middle of this business district. And while it was a pretty groundbreaking piece of sculpture, most people that had to live and work around there pretty much generally hated this piece, because they thought it was divisive, because they thought it was ugly. It broke up the space in such a way that a nice view, or, you know, who was on the other side of this thing. Basically, it was taken down and removed, and the artist never showed it again in public. So this is a really interesting thing, where you actually have a really groundbreaking piece of work, but it didn't necessarily fit the place where he put it, right? I mean, I can understand why he put it there, but that was where he was not having a conversation with that community at all. Another one is called Scaffold, which is a Sam Durant piece, and it's intended to represent scaffolding from public executions in America. And he toured this kind of around the country for a while, and in other countries. But then it was installed in the new sculpture park in Minneapolis at the, what's that place? The Walker Art Center. And it drew immediate backlash from the community, because there's a large Native American community up here. And in that area, the United States' largest mass execution took place. So for them, it was a very personal reminder of what happened in this area. So while he didn't design it for the space, this one kind of falls on the curator of, like, not having a conversation with her community before having this piece installed. In the end, they ended up having a dialogue about the piece, and he took it down, gave all the materials to them to dispose of, and actually signed over the intellectual property rights to this piece to the First Nation peoples up here in Minnesota. So that one kind of came out with a much better outcome, although a lot of people were still upset, like, oh, he was censored. But you know, in the end, you really have to understand not only the space you're working on, but the communities that are around that. I mean, in this country, it goes without saying that any land we're working on, you know, is contested land, because it's all been taken from, you know, the Native Americans. So that you have to acknowledge that right from the get-go before even, who owned it 10 years ago or why it might be contested now. So you really have to kind of take all of that into consideration. That said, one of the biggest things about doing public work, I think, is building relationships. You're building relationships with the community. You're building relationships with your neighbors that are adjacent to your site. You're building relationships with everybody in there. And usually, it's hard when you're starting out in public art because you have residencies that are only like weeks long or a couple months long. And in the end, it's really difficult to forge relationships with your community in such a short amount of time. That's why for me, the longer I spend in a place, the more successful the project is, because I actually get a chance to have a dialogue with the people that live there, but like even having a dialogue with the land. I've done projects way out in the middle of nowhere, and just sitting in that place for 3 weeks allows me to, become friends with the land and the streams and the cows, whatever. And it's really important. It just allows you to understand things without going in and just saying, I'm an artist and, I see this. After you sit in a space for a while, it allows you to really see what's really going on there, and not just through the eyes of an artist, but, through the eyes of somebody that may live in that space or exists in that space. In the end, all of those things, it's really about arriving at a goal or a concept, or, what is it you want to make? So from there, I'm going to go into site, and many of these things are the same. It's like you got to consider the history of the site, the adjacent spaces, who's there, whether that's, landlords, slumlords, industrial spaces, commercial spaces, or even if you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's like you have to consider, is this project going to disrupt the natural wildlife of the region? Is it going to be harmful to the surrounding ecosystems? It's really important to bring all of the surrounding areas into play. Doing this kind of work relies on a lot of permissions. This is not something, unless you want to be a guerrilla artist, and I'm not going to go there or lead you down that path, as exciting as it may be. You really have to get a lot of permissions when dealing with public space, and it can take a long time. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. You might have the best project, and in the end, one stakeholder might not be on board, and the whole thing gets tanked. So it takes a certain amount of diplomacy and being nice, and sometimes not always getting your way. But it can also be a really interesting way to understand how, business owners and landowners think, right? And where was I going with that? Anyway, but part of that process about gaining permissions also relies heavily on, the more beautifully and concretely you can present your ideas to non-art people. It's one thing when you're just presenting to art critics or curators, right? Because they understand the process, and they understand what artists go through, and aesthetics. But when you're presenting them to landowners and business owners and people who don't have much of a background in art, it can be very difficult to get your point across. And that's where being super diligent in terms of making sketches, even making models, anything that can get your point across without having to use art, lingo, will really help. So, working in public space can kind of force you to really expand the languages with which you communicate how you operate. Then there's this idea of creative placemaking, which is, how do you bring out, through creative process, really sort of bring out the nature or the history of a local space or a local culture. And that's pretty widespread right now. I'm kind of gotten into a different, being fairly nomadic. I'm kind of into creative migrations, or, you know, there's a lot of people who are displaced, refugees, migrant workers. And so you have to take into consideration, are you working on a specific place, or possibly you're working on movement through that space or around that space or away from that space. So that's kind of an interesting thing to consider. I've done quite a few projects that have been mobile, that have been about something moving through space. And I think that can be just as interesting and important as working on specific spaces itself. Then, of course, like I said, there's always environmental impact issues. You know, is what you're putting in this space in any way harmful to, you know, the water system, to, you know, local pollinators? I think we've been sort of misled for so many years about just using the land as a resource, not only to strip mine, but also just like, you know, we forget to consider all of the ecosystems that are in play around us. And, you know, we just put up however it's made, whatever, you know, fumes it might give off in its making, you know, spray paint, all of these different issues. So for me, it's very important to consider, you know, to leave the least amount of footprint or damage or impact on the actual, you know, the natural ecosystems that are in play there. Even, you know, the ones under the ground, you name it. It's you know, there's ever branching circles of connectivity out there, most of which are non-human. So we have to be aware of those as well. And then part of this whole thing can be summed up. There's a book that came out, I think around the turn of the millennia, if that's a term, I don't even know. But anyway, Borio wrote a book called Relational Aesthetics, and some of you may have read that, but it was kind of it kind of brought out a new way of understanding the aesthetics of artwork in terms of who the artwork does not stand alone. The aesthetics of that piece also include the viewer, right? It includes the viewer. Every compositional aspect of a project includes what's next to it as well, right? So we have to take into account whatever we're building or designing in this space is how it's going to interact with the spaces around it, directly around it. And it's a fairly interesting idea. It just really makes you conscious of how what you make fits into a larger canvas around the space, right? So your viewer becomes part of the work. Everything that enters into that and goes out and is around that actually kind of helps shape how you see that piece of work. Amanda, if you'll have a word from our sponsors here, I'm going to plug in before I run out of juice. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so I thought this would be a good time, actually. She's starting to put something into the chat to familiarize our audience with the two sites. So if you have or have not been to our campus, you can get an idea of where NEST is going to be and some of its goals. So I'm going to put into the chat our two addresses, because as we've been discussing, NEST will take place, one at Dale Mabry and a second at the Ybor City campus. So the addresses are now in the chat, and I'll ask my colleague Emiliano to show on Google Earth those two locations. This really kind of brings together kind of the nexus of all these things you're talking about, how public art and social practice and environmental art all kind of collide and overlap when we're thinking about NEST and how we're going to approach design. So this is the Dale Mabry campus. You get a nice aerial view. This is a slightly older view of our campus. Where the parking lot is on the left is now a new allied health building. But that green, sort of a little more brownish, but the green area with the trees that's getting zoomed in on right now, this is where NEST will be situated at Dale Mabry. And you can see it's a really interesting part of campus because it's located between the health sciences building, the science building, humanities, and then social sciences, and really this prominent place on campus where lots of different students in different programs all interact. And often where visitors to our campus first walk onto the campus grounds. And then the Ybor site, I'll give Emiliano a moment. If you've been, it's just north of Palm Avenue. And I was sort of chuckling, Tori, when you were talking about interacting with the different residents of the sites, which sometimes includes cows. At Ybor, we have no cows, but we do have chickens and roosters that range everywhere. But the nest site for Ybor City campus, as we zoom in here, we're kind of going up from Palm. It will be located on the east side, so just to the right of the visual arts building, which we're zooming in on. If you've been to the campus to visit the gallery there, it's the building right on the bottom of the screen there, so it's just north of that, next to the visual arts building on campus. It's a site where there used to be a public sculpture by Jerry Meatyard, and now is relatively underutilized. So both sites will be transforming these for flexible use. And we're so excited that you guys are all here with us as participants, because as we keep discussing, Tori, you said this very nicely, the dialogue is the artwork, right? These will be designed with your input and with your feedback. And today you're gonna get to imagine what you might do if you were the artist, as we look through the schematics, which again are put into the chat. But rather than Tori coming in, which he could have done, and saying, here's my artwork, here's my idea, and just kind of plop it down into the site, we want to hear what you guys would like. What kind of issues do you think that these should touch on, given the project's theme or title, Nourishment, Education, Social Terraces? What kind of aesthetics would make you want to be in this space? You know, do you want it to be bold, or do you want it to be more calm and soothing? If Florida, to get people to spend time outside, you need some shade. So what kind of shade would you put in? Would it be shade sails or greenery? What kind of greenery? Do we think about native plantings? So really excited to hear all of your feedback. And so Tori, I think I've filled sufficient time. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Sure, yeah. Well, so now we're gonna try and do a little bit of this workshop. And so I've set up sort of a drawing board here, and I know you guys have some maps. So I thought maybe we could just do some mapping exercises that would kind of follow two, hold on. You know, I thought maybe on one sheet we could kind of go over considering what's already in the space and what needs to be thought of and in terms of interacting with this space. And then maybe on the second one, we could start going on from that script and try and think about what we would like to put into this space or what we'd like to bring into this space. You know, I feel like there are a couple of interesting spaces and there's some real challenges to be sure. But I thought maybe we'd start with the Ybor City site here. And I'm just gonna tape this up, and hopefully you guys can see, but if you can't see from my computer here, and it's probably too small, I'm gonna move it in. We can, you can at least follow along because you're gonna have a copy of this at your place. But I'm gonna try and zero this in a little bit better if I can. Yeah, I don't know, is that legible or too far away?
I can see it all right. I can't speak for everyone else. Feel free to put into the chat.
Well, tell you what, I'm going to put up my own copy, which is a little bit larger, and you guys can kind of follow along on yours. Let me figure out which way is north. So this is north.
Yeah, you got it.
Top.
So we're starting with the Ybor campus.
Yeah, so this is the Ybor site. And you've got a nicely rendered, thank you, Emiliano, rendered map of this site. So you know that this is parking lot. I mean, some of this I'm not really going into necessarily, or I didn't bother sketching that out. because our space is primarily what I've got on here. But there's still things that we need to consider. So, you know, one of the things, and this is in terms of considering what's around this, this is a kind of an isolated site in terms of where it's at. We know that we've got what, fine arts and performing arts over here, right? So all of these things, if you want to map in, is just know like what's going into it. So we've got, you know, first of all, we got a parking over here. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a woodpecker chipping away at the barn back there, if you're wondering what that sound is. Then we've got fine arts and performing arts over here. And then in terms of across the street this way, we actually have the benefit of a sidewalk, which we'll go into a second, but what's the neighbors down here to the south of us? And I don't know if there's any real access to that space. That might just be the back of their building, which would render it, you know, kind of useless for our purposes. But I think one of the things we need to consider is, and I'm going to put this in purple, I don't even know if you can see that, is in terms of flow of traffic. I mean, since this is, both of these are on campuses and they're here for the students, we want to consider, you know, who's moving through the space and where they're moving. I think one of the most interesting things about this space, what we have to work with is pretty much this right here. So we've got a green space, two green spaces. We've got this platform here, which is a giant concrete, almost like a stage or a giant plinth of sorts. And I think over here, these spaces have a little bit too much sort of, there's a, you know, street sign and a bench, and we're probably not going to get ourselves tangled up in all that, as you can see from the thing. But the spaces we want to consider are right here. So I think one of the most interesting things that we have is this right here. So we've basically got a walkway that's already built into our green space that goes straight through it right here. And then of course, we also have the sidewalk down here. So, you know, in terms of how people are going to move through this space or how they're going to view it, these are our two most prominent, you know, pedestrian corridors. So that's really going to come into play when we think of like who sees this, who's going to engage with it. And this right here, this walkway is really great because we can actually incorporate that into the piece. So this is already built in. It's pretty wide open in terms of vegetation. In terms of anything that's going to be an issue in the way, we've got, apparently there's this space right here, which is the doorway for, what is that, power, DW, Tico?
Yeah, it's power.
Is that who owns? Yeah, so that we need to leave enough space here. So when you're thinking about that, there's got to be enough space that they can access these gates, which swing out here, I believe, if I remember correctly. We also know, as Amanda said, that there are chickens, which apparently raise holy hell on things that get planted. So, you know, that's going to affect how and what we plant in here. To some extent, we're going to want to think about that. In terms of whenever you're doing, especially doing earthworks or anything environmental that has growing things, we need to consider power supply and water supply. I believe right up in here, this is part of the sculpture area back up here. So we know that up here we got water and power accessible to some degree, which is good for our purposes. So coming into this space, then it really becomes, you know, we've got a nice lawn. We've got a couple nice lawns here, green spaces. We've got a stage, and we've got this corridor right through the middle of it. To me, those are the big questions, or the big positives that we have to work with here. So the question becomes, you know, do we actually want to utilize this as a stage, or do we put something kind of sculptural element up here that then can be viewed or pondered from down here? You know, if it's a stage, we could actually consider working with the performing arts students and creating some kind of platform for them to have continued performances up there. Maybe we put something up here that invites dialogue, like actually create a space with a table and some benches so that this can be, you know, since it's on a raised concrete plinth, if you put people up here sitting around the table, it's going to become a public dialogue, right? Because they're going to be on display. So any action that we might do on here is going to be on display. So then if that's the case, we have to consider, you know, do we build an earthen ramp to get up here, right? How do people get up on this stage? Do we, you know, do we want to make some berms here, some earthworks for people to sit on, right? Perhaps to witness what's happening on the stage. Do we want to put something over here as well? And, you know, do we connect these? I mean, it's pretty wide open to us. It's a pretty wonderful position to be in, to have permission to use this space to develop in so many possible fashions. You know, do we want to put some trees in here that maybe shade this and create a nice, beautiful corridor to walk through? We could build some trellises that go over. I got to start using different colors of everything. You know, put something that goes over the walkway, perhaps. I mean, these are very, very crude drawings, so I'm hoping yours at home are a little bit better than mine. But, you know, here, this walkway through here, we have an opportunity to create a really beautiful sort of a tunnel. Like going through here is going to be going through the heart of our project. So, I mean, what do we have on this side and what do we have on this side? Are in many ways connected simply because they have a pathway going straight through them. So maybe the dialogue is just about this area, right? Maybe it's just about passing through, and we have some kind of earthworks or berms and gardens on one side and on the other. And maybe we don't necessarily use this. These are some of the questions that I'd like for you guys to think about. Is like, how do the elements that we have at our disposal, how can we design them and develop them to create something that will continue to be engaged with and will be easily maintained, but also will be of interest to you guys. And that's one of the important things for me is I don't necessarily want to just make, I think that's the difference between, say, a landscape design and public art design is we want to really create something that's going to continue to engage you in a fashion beyond just like sitting in a park, right? You know, it's one thing to design a beautiful space here, but how can we make something that's going to engage you on a level beyond just sitting on the berm and taking a nap? I mean, that's pretty great too, and especially for students, I imagine that might be nice too. But I don't know, down in Florida, that might not be as useful as more temperate climates. But the idea here is that we can create some kind of vegetative sculptured space that will continue to offer you guys some kind of use or engagement down the road. I know this looks like no, I don't even know what that looks like. But if you go to this space, that's what you should consider is like, you know, maybe sometimes just sit there and see, you know, watch who passes by, see how much traffic there is. There's probably not a lot right now, especially because of COVID. But, you know, think about these two beautiful green spaces, this big possible stage, and then this walkway that kind of goes right through the heart of it. I mean, a lot of times you can kind of think about these, you know, it's like the Gaia theory is that the Earth is not a planet, it's an actual living body, and our bodies work in many of the same ways that the body of the Earth does. And so you can almost think about these sculptures as a body. It's like, you know, where does the energy come from? How do things move through it? Where's the blood flow? What are the bones of the body? You know, whatever we make here, we want to make sure that it can withstand, you know, Florida has some pretty harsh weather. We got to think about that. The last time I visited, there didn't seem to be a lot of drainage issues at this site, but there will be at the next site, which we'll go into in a minute. So you got to take, you know, how this is going to hold up, what's going to grow there. You know, obviously we need to look into native species, or, you know, we can't really bring apple trees in here because it's going to be too hot to grow most apples down there. So we got to think about plants that will, that'll survive and thrive in the Florida environment. We got to think about, you know, who's going to take care of this. You know, are we going to put some maintenance guys through hell trying to keep it up nice? You know, there's a lot of these different variables that we need to consider when actually, you know, building an earthwork or planting gardens, right? You know, who's going to care for it? Who's going to keep these things alive? You know, in the end, it would be kind of nice if it was more of a communally maintained and cared for space, right? So that everybody, you know, especially if you're growing something that can be eaten or that is productive, it's nice when everybody contributes, right? Instead of, you know, letting the maintenance guy take care of it and you just kind of waltz in and pick some fruit when it's ready. It's nice for everybody to actually have some intellectual and physical, you know, property in this game here. So,
Tory, there's a few people making comments. They really love this idea of trees and color, talking about their experiences, and, you know, students sit out there and draw. You know, especially like the drawing students, they go out there for still lives and perspective drawings. You know, and as everyone's going through, and
should we do some questions?
Well, I would say this is a good time to transition for the other site too. I was going to say, like, feel free. I'm drawing along too. I don't know if you can see because of my virtual background, but as you make your own drawings, feel free to share them with us, you know, now, or you can email me. I'll put my email into the chat, because we'd love to see what you guys imagined as Tory was explaining some of the possibilities and a bit of the process. You know, we have a survey which we'll share at the end of the event. It was put in at the beginning as well, where you can just kind of give general feedback and input, but having something like these site maps where you guys are imagining, you know, kind of wistfully what you would love to see, we would love to see those as well, so Tory can be inspired by you.
Yeah, and I'm not just mining you guys for ideas. Like I said, if it wasn't a COVID time, we would be sitting around actually having a dialogue together, exchanging ideas freely and kind of coming up with some kind of consensus. But I want you to still have a voice in this. And so if there's really good design ideas, put them out there, and then we can just continue, you know, maybe we'll reach out to you digitally to talk more about it. But I thought maybe before we switch to the main site, if there were any specific questions, or do we want to just do them all at the end?
It looks like there's no specific questions about this site, so we can keep going and address more questions later.
All right, I'm going to switch over my elaborate tech-savvy drawings here. I believe that's north. Yeah, this is really difficult to talk about without having you guys to bounce questions off and to actually talk to. But so I'm trying to hold it together here as best I can. How are we doing on time?
Doing good. 15 minutes left.
Good. 12. Okay. All right. Now this also is a really interesting site because there's a ton going on around this. These little dots here are trees that are permanent. So they're all going to stay in there for starters. I mean, just to identify the things that we have, this is part of, I believe, a little pollinator garden over here. And so this is an area we're not really going to futz with. Leave that. We got some trees over here that were part of the, is it the Mesozoic Gardens project?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we're near the Sciences Building, for those of you who don't know, and they have really interesting plantings that relate to things that they're teaching in the classroom, like Mesozoic era plants.
Yeah, now I know that these trees especially here, and these two are very large and well established. I mean, they're definitely not going to be anything that happens to those. But if I'm also not mistaken, there's a couple of benches currently. I think there's 2 benches over here, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know if those are movable or not, but if they are, we may redistribute them according to our needs. And then the one real tree that's kind of like we have to really think about is this one in the center that has a little plaque there, because that's pretty much right in the center of our little work area. And that can't be moved, which means we're going to have to figure out a way to really nicely incorporate that into the design of this space. What's interesting about this space too is we have a big corridor. Of course, you have the raised walkway up here. That's actually nice because what it's going to do is it's going to provide a heightened viewpoint of the entire project. So even though there's tons of traffic down here, this is going to kind of be a really beautiful balcony by which we'll be able to see down on the whole thing. So that's something we need to consider in terms of our visual design, is that some things will actually be able to be seen from up above. But I know that there's a big corridor coming in from the parking lot here, right? So we've got a lot of student traffic coming this way. I believe we have a similar thing coming from this side, you know, coming in from a huge parking lot. I guess that's just as big as the back, right? So there's a lot of students coming from that way. I know over here, there's kind of like a, you know, you've got the tables with the solar umbrellas, a couple of different seating options over here. So this is already a kind of social space that students use and engage with. And then if I'm not mistaken, there's also another corridor over here because there's science building, this building. Yeah, and then of course there's the steps coming down this way into all this area. So this is kind of at an intersection, whereas the other one was one path going through and then a sidewalk. You pretty much are getting it from all angles here. There's also coming in from this angle, which is where the Mesozoic gardens are, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which are really beautiful, tucked in and underneath over there. So that kind of brings this question up, is this is just a big unused green space, but you've got all these pathways of traffic that go around it. So one thing I think that one of the most important things to consider is how do we invite this traffic into the site? I think where we're at right now, the most usable site, or the most usable space that we're going to have to work with, is probably going to be like right in here in this part of it. So if we want to build some pathways that kind of wind in, you know, bring students in, give them a way into this, we've got 3 kind of really clear ways to enter into this. You know, what form those pathways take, that's what we need to decide. Do we put down paver stones? Do we just put in, you know, fill them with sod? And do we put in gravel pathways? You know, how do we want to invite this traffic in here? Which means considering how the path or the invitation fits right here at the edge of the project, but also then how we lead them in. I know we've also been talking about designing the earthwork, especially in this, as some kind of like amphitheater, or a space that will or could eventually be like held for outdoor classrooms or for talks or you know, public events. So in terms of then, if we're going to create some kind of earthwork in here, you know, first of all, what shape is it? And then how do we fit it in here so that we're not, you know, disturbing any trees? You know, do we have a big crescent shape right here that's multi? And then, you know, it creates this nice place for people to sit and look out facing north. But then it's like, how do we incorporate the traffic? I mean, there's some of the interesting things about bringing all these considerations into play. It's like, you know, we could build a really great earthwork right there, but maybe then it's only accessible from one direction, and we kind of have these two paths cinched off, right? So it's like, all right, well, maybe we don't do a crescent. Maybe we've got several segments here with walkways that go in between them, right? So maybe here's one, and then there's a partial arc right here, right? I mean, so we can design that so that it's both a cohesive earthwork, but yet still brings the traffic in. One of the other aspects that we're thinking about here is, you know, shady area. So if we have a centralized earthwork in this space, we could pull and put up shade sails, plant trees. Of course, we got to take into account that the trees are going to take some time to grow. You know, what kind of structure can we put in here that will offer shade, but possibly something else? You know, maybe we actually put up, build a sort of like a small pavilion in there, or a partial pavilion that provides a little bit of shade overhead, maybe also some solar power. You know, one of the main things when getting into the nutrition aspect of this is what can we put in there that is going to actually develop and produce food? We're thinking that you know, turning this into a partly a food forest is a really great idea. You know, having enough fruiting trees in there that they can actually be accessed by the student body and be really productive, but also then they would grow and make shade. So, you know, so if we have, say, a dozen trees in there, you know, where are those trees going to go? How do we space them out? Do these trees perhaps help build, say, the high point or the background of the earthwork? You know, maybe the trees aren't just about dropping fruit. Maybe they are also supports for the earthwork. Perhaps when they're big enough, or even when they're mid-sized, they could be good shady spots. So there's a possibility for building these around here. You know, there's the possibility to put them in large planters. Then maybe they could be moved if they're not permanent. A lot of variables can go into that. I know on this site, something to consider when you're at this site, when you're here, I was there when it rained very heavily, and this area right here had very little drainage. The area was flooded too, but everything ran. There's a drain on the opposite side of this, so everything from this area was pretty soggy, but it drains over here. And so the question, how much this actually comes into play anyway, is something we'll have to decide. But in terms of our space, this whole area right here was a giant puddle. And that presents us with quite an issue, because if we're going to be getting a ton of rain, we don't want to have a bunch of standing water in our space. So one of the things that I was thinking about is putting in like rain garden, where you actually create sort of a wetland situation, and you plant it with plants that, one, clean the water, but also soak it up. I know in New Orleans, they do rain drains, where around a lot of the drains going down into the sewers, they'll plant these gardens because they'll want to absorb a bunch of the water to help prevent flooding, but they also, you know, they filter the water, they thrive, they create this whole little ecosystem to themselves. So this could be a whole little sort of environmental project of itself is putting in something that serves as the drain for our whole area, but is a beautiful little garden made up of, wetland plants and things that will really thrive in that environment. Because I think it's pretty safe to say you're always going to be getting rain there.
Yes, that's Florida.
Yeah.
It is 1:40, so I wanted to, as you kind of finish up with that design, read through some of the comments that have been filtering in the chat section. Mary talks about it'd be cool to have a pollinator garden at Ybor, and people are really happy that you're going to be keeping the existing trees and possibly be adding to it. Claire talks about untraditional pathways with visual variances for the atmosphere, and to think about the movement of the sun during the day so that we can create spaces that shade the visitor at different times, which, thinking about when we have students, especially on campus, would be really interesting. A lot of people were excited about your ecological solutions in the rain garden. Ruby mentioned the idea of bioswales that are there in Portland.
Yeah, very similar idea.
So at this point, if you guys have any lingering questions, put them into the chat. I've been answering some of you directly, so Tory could stay focused on the design workshop, but we did have a question early on from Travis Meek. Give me a minute and I'll go up to find it. Travis asked Tory if he made the comment that your introduction made him wonder about how our project could speak to loss. The loss of community and interaction, the loss of life in Tampa Bay because of the coronavirus, for example. This created a situation we find ourselves in during this project. So I wondered if you would like to respond to that.
Sure. And it's funny, I was thinking specifically about the Ybor site when I was there last, specifically about loss. I think that concrete plinth is a really interesting space that we can utilize. And the reason I was thinking about loss specifically at that site is because that artwork that used to be there was taken down and thrown out rather unceremoniously. And so that is in no way, the equivalent of the kind of loss that we're experiencing in this country right now. But that's what got me thinking about it. And so then I was thinking, well, that might be a nice place to set up, maybe not a performance space, but a place to have a dialogue about some of these issues, a place maybe to express grief or to express outrage, perhaps, right? And I'm not sure what form that takes, but it just seemed like, because that was already a site of pre-existing loss, that might be a good place to create something to further that conversation. In terms of the other spaces, it's difficult for me to think sometimes politically, because that's like, it becomes about fecundity and, life and, fostering organisms and all that. And I know in many ways that can be political in this day and age. But in terms of memorializing loss or providing a place to express grief, I think that's really could be an important part of this project. Almost in the way of allowing the space to be therapeutic in reaction to loss and grief. So these are some of the areas where I'm hoping your input will help shape what we actually develop in there.
We also had some comments highlighting the cultural diversity of the area. Ybor City in particular has a very, very strong, thriving, diverse cultural identity. The Spanish heritage and culture was specifically noted. Do you have any ideas how that might be reflected in the project for those who might be wondering?
Well, the first thing that kind of comes to mind, like I said, thinking environmentally or agriculturally, as I have been doing quite a bit lately. I mean, it might be nice to do some research and understand how the different cultures of that area, you know, we already know that different cultures have different foods that they have, traditional crops that they grow. It might be interesting to represent these cultural differences through different plants. You know, going back to the Native American cultures and what they grew. And then that could in some way be delineated or explained on the site so that people who were there could understand, you know, this is like a Cuban garden, or this is something that may have been grown by the Cuban community, or, you know, these were traditional Native American things. So, but not only through the different plants or through different, you know, horticultural motifs, we could also, I mean, this is where community feedback becomes very important, but we could also incorporate different motifs, whether that's into how we shape the soil, or, you know, we're going to have to do some, whether it's walkways or retaining walls, there's going to be some structural elements in there. This thing isn't just going to be dirt and plants. So, you know, we could incorporate ceramic tiles that have different motifs. We could, maybe in the way the walkway is designed in terms of the different colored stones or whatever, we could represent these other cultures through some of these, through some of the structural elements that would help tie all this together.
Wonderful. Though, like one of our participants point out, nothing wrong with dirt and plants, which I think you would agree.
That's pretty much all I got. Yeah.
Oh, and Mary, kind of going off of what you just mentioned about the ceramic tiles, said maybe things like tiles designed by the students. So there's lots of possible integrations with the local community. We are working with our campus beautification committees and sustainability. So and faculty. So this will be really, really interesting, but I mean, community members too. There's lots of community partners, as you saw at the beginning when I did my thanks. If there's no more questions, we are at time, but this doesn't mean we can't still hear from you. We've been putting the chat link, the survey into the chat for you guys. We'll do that one more time. So you can use that to give us direct feedback. There's some multiple choice or like multiple entry questions, but also some long form comments. So you can give us any of your ideas and feedback above and beyond the design concepts we were discussing today, in addition to. But that will be it for today's workshop. I just want to let you guys know we have 2 more events for NEST that are currently planned. So additional opportunities for you to learn more about the project and all of the different layers that are going into it. Our next one will be held on Wednesday, October 28th from 6 to 7 p.m. With a panel of local leaders to discuss the topic of diversity and inclusion, something that we were discussing a little bit at the end of this event. And then our last event will be an interactive root camp with our NEST community partner, Rooted Resistance, which will be held Thursday, November 12th from 12:30 to 1:45 p.m. So different days, different times for those of you who have very, very diverse schedules. So thank you, Tory, so much for sharing your time and your expertise to getting the creative juices flowing for all of us. Remember, everyone, your feedback is crucial. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Dr. Berry for doing the introductions. Hopefully, we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for tuning in, participating. And as I said, I encourage you all to take your maps, visit the sites, and do some sketching, see what comes up. And we'd love to hear from you.
All right, thanks. Bye, everyone.